there was this art form that could allow me to do what I'd always wanted to do, what I knew my purpose was from a very, very young age. And it would become this catharsis so that simultaneously I was creating craft as an artist and healing as a human.
We all search for that spark which fuels our desire to fully engage in our lives. We look for the courage to experience moments where we can come alive instead of watching life pass us by. You're listening to the Front Row Factor, leaving fear and insecurity behind by exploring stories of top performers that are living life in the front row. Get ready to stand up, step up, and live it up with your host, John Vroman.
Hey, Front Row family, John Vroman here. Welcome back to the Front Row Factor podcast. I'm so excited that you're with me today because we are talking with Caroline Rothstein. Now, as you know, we talk to people who are living life in the front row, and that is exactly why this woman is the perfect guest for our show. She is a New York City-based spoken word poet, journalist, body empowerment advocate, and arts educator. This is a woman who's been performing for over a decade all over the world, and her work has appeared in BuzzFeed, Narratively, Williams Magazine, the Jewish Daily Forward. She's even the producer on the forthcoming documentary, The Kids. Her BuzzFeed video, titled Fat Is Not a Feeling, had over 3.5 million views online in a single week. She is a force for good. You're going to love this chat. You can get more of her at carolinerothstein.com. And also, we'll link to all this stuff in our show notes at frontrowfactor.com. Well, I want to tell you that in our conversation today, we have a great chat, which starts all the way from early in her life, which is an incredible story. And I should warn you, it's pretty traumatic. She actually, in her own words, says, hey, I'm a casual trauma dropper. And she thinks she's processed these experiences so fully that she can talk about this stuff so openly. But just know it's very real and it's tough. These are very tough situations that she overcame. But I want to tell you that on the other side of this, she is able to share and articulate her message and these ideas and this wisdom so wonderfully. You're going to really enjoy this. We talk about all sorts of stuff, but we talk about how she came to the realization that several of her passions and activities in life could really fuel her purpose for living. We talk about when she started talking publicly about her life's traumas and how that all started at her boarding school in Switzerland. We talk about the conversation she once had with her thighs and how to deal with and grow through the grief that we all will experience. She's got great energy. Like I said, this is a woman with a heart of gold. You're going to love this interview with Caroline Rothstein. Enjoy. Ladies and gentlemen, Caroline Rothstein. Am I saying it right?
Yes.
Okay, good. I was thinking to myself, I'm going to butcher the name.
No,
I have such love for this woman, and that yet I've never asked the question if I say it correctly.
Crushed it.
Welcome to the Front Row Factor podcast. The whole community would cheer and applaud if they could at the moment, but so glad you're here. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored and hyped to be here.
So, Caroline, I want to start with something a little different than I normally do, which is tell me about what's going on right now in your life. Give me the highlight reel. 60 seconds or more of like good stuff. What's happening that you're excited about, proud of? You know, that's the deal.
I love that 60 seconds or more. That's never in my life been the lead off. It's always 60 seconds or less, but 60 seconds or more. The highlight reel, what's happening. I mean, I feel like I got to just like start with today.
It's a good place.
I woke up at 5:30 a.m., which is not standard behavior for me. Not that I don't like getting up early, but I got up at 5:30 a.m. because I had to finish editing an article that was due to my editor today. And then I worked on the chapter overview for a book proposal I'm working on, sent a bunch of emails, and got ready for this. And all in the 4 hours that I've been awake thus far on Monday, it's amazing like how we can span the gamut of emotions and thoughts and ideas in a very, very brief amount of time. And so I feel like that's a great metaphor for the highlight reel of my life right now, which is that, last week I had what I'd say was one of the most important performances of my life. I was the speaker and performer at an annual memorial lecture that my parents founded in my brother's name after he died 13 years ago at his high school. And so every year they bring a different speaker. One year it was like a scientist. Another year it was a Holocaust survivor. And this year the school was like, oh, knowing what your daughter does, let's bring her. And so it's like that happened last week. And then the next many days of my life were so jam-packed with a bunch of moving around and other travel that like I haven't even had a chance to process that. So the highlight reel is that every day, every moment is packed with unbelievable blessings and like these moments of doing exactly what I want to be doing. But it's like my emotional self hasn't quite caught up to real time. And so there's still these like doubts and thoughts and questions of like former Caroline that are caught up in the current highlight reel. And so I feel like one of the coolest things about life is that sometimes like your soul's way ahead of the game. Like, you know what you want, you know what your purpose is, and like your body's just not there yet. Or like your brain knows exactly how to make some stuff happen and who you are, and your emotions aren't there yet. And so I feel like this morning was a great experience in witnessing that my emotional self is not totally up to speed with what's happening in the rest of my life right now, which is fascinating.
Now, I can imagine as a writer and a performer that fascinating content is what you crave. So this is probably rich in creative time for you. So
totally.
Caroline, take us back. So now that we know that you were performing, speaking, I don't know what the term would be at this event. Mm-hmm. And take us back now in time and give us a little bit of your life story. So if people aren't familiar with you and your work and what you've done, maybe just take us from, Caroline, at birth, and give us the few-minute version of how we got to right now where we are today.
So I was born on May 30th, 1983
Woohoo!
in Chicago, Illinois at
Great
Michael
day.
Reese Hospital.
The world's never been the same.
And fast forward a little bit. I'm a casual trauma dropper, just like for everyone out there. So I'm going to say a lot of things that like sound really intense, but I've totally processed it all in therapy and I'm doing great. So from ages...
That's a great setup for the record.
Right?
Yeah,
right?
That's a great setup.
Yeah, so I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago in a John Hughes movie, right? Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Like that was my upbringing. And from ages 11 to 21, I struggled with an eating disorder. And people always ask, what eating disorder? And it's like all of them, a total cocktail, like a little anorexia, a lot of bulimia, some overexercising, some binge eating disorder, some eating disorder not otherwise specified. So that lasted for 10 years. And also during that time, I was sexually abused for a year and a half in high school by a peer. And then my first month of college, I was raped by a stranger. And then a week later, my younger brother, Josh, who was 15 at the time, was hit by a car and killed while walking on the sidewalk in the suburbs of Chicago near where we grew up. And so... okay, right? So like that's a lot of trauma. That's a lot of really tough stuff. I've also experienced a lot of other grief and loss. Like 6 months before my brother died, one of my best friends died in her sleep. And unfortunately, the list goes on and on of grief and loss. And so there's like that content, right? And then the context of it is that I've been an artist my entire life. I started writing poetry when I was 5 years old. I started writing stories and creating, construction paper nonfiction autobiographies of my life when I was a little kid. I discovered acting at a young age. I was a singer, actress, dancer growing up. And my plan was to be the next Bette Midler and the next Tom Wolfe as a nonfiction writer. So it was like, oh, great. I'll go to Broadway and I'll write books. And then I got to college at the University of Pennsylvania my freshman year. And as I mentioned, right, like these two horrific things happened my first month of college. One of the most vital, I mean, literally like life-saving things that happened was I discovered spoken word poetry. And suddenly I could be a writer, a performer, and an activist all at once. And I could heal. Like suddenly there was this art form that could allow me to do what I'd always wanted to do, what I knew my purpose was from a very, very young age. And it would become this catharsis so that simultaneously I was creating craft as an artist and healing as a human. And then the things became intertwined and interchangeable. And so the healing happening in my art was simultaneously what I was producing and giving to the world. And that became my career and my profession. And so I am a internationally touring poet and a freelance journalist and an arts educator. I teach a lot of writing workshops as well. I'm actually later today going to be working on the curriculum to teach the first ever journalism course at a literary arts education in New York that I've been doing poetry workshops at for years. So now I'm about to bring my journalism hat over there. It's really exciting. And it's funny because for many years I was using the word advocate instead of activist. And I pulled back a little from the word activist. And I've recently felt okay using it again to describe the work that I'm doing, which is amazing, right? Like how I have this line of a poem, "It's okay to fluctuate in your identity." It's a poem called What I Learned in College. And I feel like that like line is super present for me right now, that like, it's okay to fluctuate in your identity, like, especially as a professional, you know, like our bios are living, breathing, tangible forces. They're not stuck in stone. And so I'm really feeling like I'm owning that part of myself as an activist lately in a rejuvenated and invigorated way. And the artist and activist in me, again, are interchangeable. People are always like, what's your work about? And it's like personal narrative and social justice, which I really thrive off of that Adrienne Rich quote that the personal is the political. So for me, everything that's happened to me is political, right? Like when I talk about recovering from an eating disorder, when I talk about healing from assault, when I talk about ending violence, when I talk about growing up in a John Hughes movie, which is dripping with a bunch of white privilege, you know, that's all political, especially since I'm interested in dismantling said privilege and systems of oppression. That's a whole other, maybe it is the same conversation, but that's, the brief bio-ish.
I love it. Thank you for being so open and just sharing your heart, which I've seen you do on stage, and now so grateful that you're sharing this with the Front Row community. Caroline, first I want to say that my heart goes out to you for the trauma that you have endured in your life. And you know, in a moment like this, I'm often at a loss for words as to what to say, because what comes to mind and comes to my heart is I just want to acknowledge that is an incredible amount of trauma that you have now, you know, made it through, and you have handled in such a way that I think so many others that have endured trauma in their lives would gain inspiration and light from. So I want to talk a little bit about this transformation that you experienced in your life. And I often refer to these transformational moments as back row to front row, where we just move our seat in life, we move our perspective on life. We either, sometimes we're dragged into the front row, sometimes we walk to the front row reluctantly, sometimes we jump into the front row with our entire hearts. And everybody's story is so different and unique. Talk to us a little bit about, and share with the community, what were some of the tools that you utilized in order to create this awesome transformation in your life?
Yeah, it's so amazing because I've listened to your podcast before and I've thought about this, like, what's my front row, you know, my move from the back to the front row. And I feel like there are a lot. So I fear mentioning one because I don't want it to be all encompassing. But the most important one, the pivotal one, the most important one that literally saved my life was when I was 21 years old I was a junior in college at the University of Pennsylvania, and it was November 18th. And I remember that date because sadly, that's also the date of the Jonestown massacre from the late 70s. And I was taking a course on religious violence and cults. So I had this date in the front of my mind, coincidentally. So it's November 18th, 2004. And at this point, I've had an eating disorder for 10 years. I had struggled with depression. I'd struggled with self-harm. By now, my brother had died. My friend Kat had died. And I'd gone through the other abuses and traumas I referenced. And yet here I am at the University of Pennsylvania, an Ivy League school. I've worked so hard to get there. I'm running Penn's spoken word poetry group, the Exolano Project. At the time, I was the head of V-Day and the Vagina Monologues at Penn, which I helped build into a really large organization. I was doing all this activist work. I was performing all over campus. Everyone knew who I was as a performer, as an activist. I had an incredible group of friends, and I'd always had really amazing friends. And suddenly I was able to see the difference between the fact that I was slowly killing myself with an eating disorder and the fact that I had a life worth living. And so I literally had this evening that was like a spiritual awakening where I sat on my bedroom floor in West Philadelphia with my best friend, Chloe, and I laid out my life, literally putting my hand piece by piece on the floor. And I looked at everything and I said to her, I keep getting closer to death. I keep getting closer to death. And I felt like my soul was on the line. It wasn't just my body, but my soul was going to die if I didn't make a choice to change. And if I didn't choose to fully recover. And I don't mean just recover. I mean fully recover and fully commit to feeling everything and to sitting with my emotions in full and allowing myself to essentially be intoxicated by the emotions that exist in life, good or bad, challenging or easy, adverse or triumphant, whatever it be. And so that was it. And I felt like my brother's spirit was in the room. I felt like Kat's spirit was in the room. I felt like G/D. I'm Jewish. For me, God, or really, I feel like God's a metaphor for unconditional love. So the essence of unconditional love was in this bedroom with us. And that was it. And I decided that purging was not an option. And that was it. I stopped making myself throw up. And I peeled back recovery like layers of an onion, for pun intended, if you will, where it was okay, if I can't make myself throw up, it really sucks to be full from a binge. So I should probably stop binging. And if I can't make myself binge, it really doesn't feel good to eat emotionally. So if I can't eat emotionally, how do I eat? And I had to relearn how to eat, essentially. And I had to relearn how to feel. And I had to relearn how to have a conversation inside my body when I wasn't allowed to hurt it. And that took time and a lot of practice. But that moment with Chloe on my floor, junior year of college, was, I literally moved to the front row, because if I kept sitting in the back, I felt like my soul was going to die. And, there have been a lot of versions of that have happened throughout my life since. I'm 32 now, so that was 11 years ago. And still, that's the most important one, because I moved to the front row of my life, and that's informed my work professionally as well, since, my content is my life. That's the most important act, if you will, the most important scene.
Caroline, in sharing the way that you do so openly.
Yeah.
Can you take us back to a moment when you would have been at one of your earlier performances, and what was going on to be able to take? So you've had this transformation, right? You laid out your life on the floor, and then you've started to undergo this transformation. where was the time when you took it public? Where was the time when you started talking about it and writing about it? And how quickly did that happen? And how do you get to that point where you can just openly share about this? And what was that process like?
So here's what's so amazing. I started openly sharing years before that moment of transformation.
Oh, cool.
So there's two moments that I first started openly sharing. I mentioned that I was a theater kid growing up. So junior year of high school, there was this assignment in junior year acting called The Fourth Wall. And everyone had to present a real life scene of their life as if the fourth wall was there. So the audience, the class, was watching you do something private in public. And what I did was I took to school with me a big comforter and my favorite red sweatshirt that hung off my shoulder 80s style. I'd cut out the neckline. And it was the late 90s. So I used to use this mini cassette tape dictaphone that I don't know if anyone listening knows what a dictaphone is. So if you were born before 1985, you know what a dictaphone was. So I would record it was essentially like the original podcast. I was recording audio journals for myself, talking into this mini cassette tape recorder. And I sat on the stage with my sweatshirt on. And I actually, from underneath my sweatshirt, removed my bra without taking off my sweatshirt to really show the audience what it was like for me to be alone at home in my room. I'm here, literally, and I was a junior in high school, and I started talking in the dictaphone about being bulimic and the struggles I was having. And I remember I started crying, and then I finished the scene and I sat down in the chair and I stopped crying. And I remember my acting teacher pointing out that I was able to get off stage and leave what had happened on the stage there. I didn't keep hysterically crying when I sat back down in my seat in the auditorium. I was able to transition back to and now I'm in the seat. And that really stuck with me as a performer because it let me know that I was capable of being deeply vulnerable on stage without letting it control my life off stage, and also allowing my life off stage to inform my life on stage. It was this incredible experience. And then the second thing was I spent my senior year at boarding school in Switzerland, at the American school in Switzerland, because my eating disorder was so bad that my grades really struggled. And I was a really intense academic student, and going away was a way to sort of start over and allow myself to thrive in an environment away from home. And so at TASIS, I was in this huge girls' dorm. I mean, my roommate was from Serbia. My suite mates were from Brazil and Taiwan. So it's this international girls' dorm. And the faculty dorm head had been at a East Coast boarding school in the US where she made a documentary about some students who had eating disorders. And they were going to screen the documentary, a short, 15, 20-minute thing. And then they knew that I was struggling with an eating disorder because my parents had been very open with them when I got to school. Hey, Caroline has a history of eating disorders. Look out for her. If there's a problem, hopefully she'll let you know. And you can let us know too. Which is amazing of my parents to be involved in that way. And so the dorm heads came to me and they said, hey, we're going to screen this documentary. Do you want to tell your story to the dorm? And I said, sure. So that was the first time I publicly shared my story as a formal, speaking engagement. And I was in my pajamas and it was nighttime on a weeknight. And I went to the front of this classroom in our dorm, Monticello, the all-girls dorm. And I told my story. And then I started telling my story around campus for every dorm when they would do these workshops. And that's essentially how I got my start as a public speaker, right? Was sitting at the front of these classrooms at boarding school in Switzerland, which is absurd to say that I was at boarding school in Switzerland. What a gift. And for the girls and the boys dorms, I would share my story after they would screen this documentary. And then we'd do a exercise, and then people would ask me questions. We'd talk about body image. And And then I went to college and discovered spoken word, and it just naturally it flowed into there quite fluidly.
That's really cool. So was it a struggle for you to start acting, to start sharing your story? Or was that a place that you just felt so comfortable, like getting up on that stage and talking into the dictaphone and doing your thing?
Yeah.
Was that natural for you, or was that a wrestle?
That was natural for me. And I share those two stories because they were, I think that sometimes like there's something innate in us, and then it's just the right environment or moment to unlock permission for us to see who we are. And so that moment junior year in Mr. Rautenberg's theater class was like, oh, here's who you are, Caroline. And then that moment at Tassis at the Monticello dorm was like, oh, here's who you are, Caroline. And this didn't happen on accident. I'd been planning my whole life, right? I'd been writing my whole life. I'd been performing my whole life. Suddenly there was this convergence where it all came together. So I'm naturally comfortable sharing my truth. It's just who I am, and it's who I've always been. And here were these moments that were a mirrored reflection to show me that I can do this in a way that's full and whole. That just because I share my story so raw and candid with the masses doesn't mean that I feel like that's the end goal for everyone. I think our most important audience member is ourself. And so the only person that it really matters that we're telling our honest, true, authentic story to, uninhibited, vulnerable, and raw, is ourself. Beyond that, therapist, friend, lover, partner, classmates, colleagues, podcast, whatever it be, that's on us, and that varies per person. So it's funny, as I'm saying this, I'm like having an in the moment epiphany. My most challenging audience member is often myself. Like, it's super easy for me to, like, right now I'm having this epiphany in the moment with you and whoever's listening to this podcast, that my hardest audience member is myself. So it's like so easy for me to rawly, vulnerably, while we're sitting here on Skype recording me, tell you that my hardest, most challenging member of an audience is myself. And yet that's like the meta struggle, is that I am my hardest audience member. And so everyone else is super easy, but like sitting alone with myself and being like, Caroline, you're really, like earlier today, like, Caroline, you're really strong. You're on the right path. You're doing great. Like, it's hard to hear that from myself and to say that to myself. So I've actually been really working on that lately.
That's great.
Yeah.
You have to be in your own front row.
Yeah.
Yeah. On a personal note, Caroline, I'm sure you could appreciate some aspects of this as being a writer. Is when I have attempted to write in the past, I sit down and look at the computer or a notepad, and the thoughts start popping up of, what do I have to say that's unique or different? And I become my own worst critic. And oftentimes that critic is so loud, it's paralyzing to my ability to create or share. And what's worked recently for me is in writing the Front Row Factor book, I was talking to one of my best buddies, John, about this struggle. And he said, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to show up at your house. I'm going to interview you, because when we talk, you're great. You'll just answer the questions. And I'm going to interview you. We're going to get it recorded, and then we're going to transcribe that. And that's going to be the starting place for the writing.
Yeah.
And so he asks me these questions just, a couple of days ago, and I just go on this rant with this story. And he goes, it was like a 4-minute story. And he goes, all right, how long would that have taken to write? And I said, like 4 weeks. That would have taken 4 weeks to write. He goes, right, you got that out in 4 minutes. And that was the whole story. And it was from your true voice. And when you write, sometimes you're trying to write from that authentic voice. And I thought, what better way than to just speak it out, that it's my authentic voice. So I want to switch gears here just a little bit and talk about your creative process in writing, producing content. Do you wrestle with that internal dialogue? I know you do, because we're talking about right now that your own worst, the toughest audience is yourself. But talk to us about how you overcome that, because you create some compelling content, including a video that I'll have mentioned by this point already, especially in your intro with the 1.8 million YouTube views on this video that you created that I think was produced by BuzzFeed.
By BuzzFeed, and another 2.4, I think, million views on their Facebook page.
It's totally incredible. So by the way, if you're listening right now and you haven't seen this video, go check it out. Push pause, watch it right now from your phone, from wherever, pull over your car, right? And what's the title of it?
It's called Fat Is Not a Feeling.
Yeah. So talk to us a little bit about the creative process that you go through. Not necessarily just that video, although I would love to know.
Yeah.
Like maybe that's a good starting place, right? Like,
oh my God. Well, yeah, it's the perfect place to start, because it further highlights what you just shared in your process. So the way that video content came to be, whoa, it's all happening and coming full circle, and you didn't even plan it. So the producer at BuzzFeed on that video is my friend Hillary, who I went to college with, and she's incredible. Hillary Levine, she makes amazing work. And for a long time, she kept being like, girl, I love your videos. I had a series on YouTube for many years called Body Empowerment, if you want to check out those videos. And Hillary was like, I watch your videos. I love what you do. I want to make a video with you. Like, we got to make something happen. So the next time you're in LA, we got to make something happen. So literally a year ago today, it's even happening more. I was in LA surprising one of my best friends for her 30th birthday. Her husband planned this like incredible, elaborate, like human scavenger hunt of like people. And so I knew I was going out there to surprise Lindsay for a year ago today, her 30th birthday. And I was like, okay, Hillary, I'm coming to LA. Don't tell anyone. It's a big secret, but I'll be there. Let's make something happen. So we schedule a day for me to come to BuzzFeed. And in the process of getting together the content for the video, all we know is that it's going to be about my story. It's going to be about body image. I'm going to be wearing a black unitard that I've tried on at American Apparel, and to bring my like childhood, middle school poetry journals and this eating disorder scrapbook I made. And like, I don't know, we'll figure it out. And if, like a week or two before I leave, I'm on deadline for the hugest article I'd ever written, which was a big magazine feature for Williams College's alum magazine about the sexual assault prevention and response work they do on campus. And I'm like, my second draft is due to my editor. I'm freaking out. I'm overwhelmed. My body image has not been great lately, because when I'm stressed and overwhelmed, the first thing that goes for me is my body image. It flares up. And it doesn't mean that I'm struggling with eating disorder symptoms. It means that I'm a human being in a body and my body image flares up, right? And so all of a sudden, to like cope with my really distorted body image that is a direct result of being overwhelmed and stressed out, I've never publicly shared this story. This is exciting. I start trying on everything in my closet, to make sure it still fits. Like putting on dresses, skirts, pants. I'm freaking out. And midway through, I'm like, girl, what are you doing? You are freaking out. This is ridiculous. And then something else inside me says, wait a second. I'm feeling very deeply emotional. I'm either getting to the root of what's wrong, or I need to stop and pull away because I'm exacerbating something. And something inside me told me to keep going. Because you know how sometimes you do a yoga pose and it allows you to feel a certain feeling inside? That's what was happening. The physical act of putting on the clothing was getting me to a deep, deep, deep emotional space inside of myself that I couldn't access without the physical movement of putting on the clothing.
Wow.
So I land in this dress I've had since 8th grade. It's this lacy spaghetti strap Betsy Johnson dress that I've had since I was 13 years old. And I'm looking at myself in my full length mirror in my apartment, in my bedroom in Harlem in New York City. And I start crying and I look at my thighs and I hold my thighs and I like can feel my thighs talking to me. And I'm like, what's up, thighs? And my thighs, the message I'm getting from my thighs, the message is, we feel neglected and exploited. So I'm like, what's this neglect about? Oh, I've been sitting at my desk for a month, not moving, writing this article. Cool. I hear you. Total understanding of the neglect. And what's this exploitation? Oh, I had like naturally let go of a bunch of weight over the course of a year or two. And a lot of people were like, you look so good. Good for you. And I cannot stand when people do that because I think it's so offensive when we applaud each other for losing weight because A, that's like super body shaming. It implies that your body was not good when it was at a larger size. And then it implies that larger size bodies are not good at all or healthy, which is not true. Like, I'm a huge supporter of the health at every size movement. Like, all bodies are beautiful. Like, so that's the other. So when people do that, it's like, also it makes you like start to focus on that weight loss, especially if it's natural. Like, I wasn't doing anything. My body just naturally let go of weight. It was vibrating and resonating in a really authentic space. And I wasn't carrying anything extra to teach me anything or to hold on to anything. Just let go. And so then it's just focusing on this thing. And suddenly my body becomes an object of review instead of my heart, or like, I'm not thinking obsessively about my body. Now you're making me because you're telling. So that exploitation, my thighs were like, we feel exploited. So I sit down on my bed in this dress and I take off the dress and now it's just me sitting in my underwear on my bed. And then I put my hands on my stomach, which is like sort of my final frontier of self-love. My stomach and I still sometimes have a tumultuous relationship. And I was holding my stomach and I was like feeling my stomach rolls. And when you sit, if for anyone out there that has stomach fat like me, like when I sit, there's like rolls of fat that weave onto one another. And I felt my stomach say like, you need to be grateful for us every day. Like even when you're busy, there's enough time to have gratitude. You don't need to forget about thanking us, me, this. So that whole episode happens and I sit down at my computer and I also called my mother and I said to her, Mom, I'm going to be really specific. I'm having a hard day and here's what I need from you. I need you to listen to me and not judge me or give me feedback. And she was super supportive and did just that. And then at the end, she was like, okay, and now you need to sit down and finish the draft to your editor. You're going to do it. You're going to be great. And then after that call with my mother, I opened an email and I wrote, Dear Caroline. So it was a letter to myself, but I CC'd it to Hillary at BuzzFeed. And I said to her, this is a journal entry to myself, but I want you to be privy to it because it may be of use for our video. And there was a whole paragraph in there that talked about this notion of when I feel fat, I know I'm feeling something else because fat is not a feeling, which is a whole thought process I went through in that whole closet clothing episode. So I just like wrote Hillary the whole thing and she became witness to this deeply intimate experience. And in targeting it as a letter to both myself, knowing Hillary was witnessing it and holding space with it, she responded and pulled out some of those paragraphs, including the whole thing about fat is not a feeling. She's like, this is the video.
Wow.
And then we wrote the content for the video from there. So that, just like you said with your friend interviewing you, it was sometimes like knowing we're directing it. I do a lot of letter writing. A lot of my writing workshops, I'll use letter writing prompts, like write a letter from your past self to your future self, write a love letter to your most judged part of your body. Like I think letter writing is really targeted, really directed. So that's where the fat is not a feeling video came from, was living this moment and experience and allowing Hillary to bear witness to it and writing it in this way that was more direct than had I just sort of like written it on a blank page in Microsoft Word.
Yeah. So many incredible things to talk about from what you just shared. I have so many questions to ask you, and gosh, there's just so many different paths we can travel down here, Caroline. Again, I want to acknowledge you for the progress that you've made, and I want to honor you for that because I just think it's so great, and you're such a great example to so many. Just your vulnerability, your openness to talk about it. I can only imagine that how many people are listening to this, men and women.
And folks who don't identify with any gender binary.
Exactly. Yeah, perfect. Thank you, by the way, for adding that. That, individuals, human beings have wrestled with, I'm sure, many of the thoughts and emotions and feelings that you do. I particularly resonate with the idea of almost having this conversation with yourself and saying, when you talked about grabbing your thighs and asking, what's up, that idea is something that I think is extremely powerful. I remember years ago having a personal coach. Her name was Fee, and she was phenomenal. And Fee asked me at the time, she goes, when you feel, and she was listing off emotions, when you feel sad, where does that show up in your body? And I remember reacting to that going, what the heck does that even mean? This is awfully new agey. I'm looking for more concrete, like, how do I schedule my Monday? Not like when I feel anger, where does it show up in my body? So I kind of I was working my way through this. But what I realized, not in particularly that exact moment, but over the years, is the power of mindfulness, the power of awareness. And I can't help but mindfulness, awareness keeps coming up every time you talk, that the level of awareness that you have about your body and how it feels and the conversation that's happening. Listen, we all have these conversations with ourselves. We all have these conversations with our bodies and where it's this self-talk that goes on. Not all of us are greatly aware of it. It's happening, and it may be that in many ways piloting our ship, but we're not always aware of it. And when we gain the awareness of it and just recognize it, one of the, and I've said this before, it's one of my favorites, is that, and I think I read this in The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer. And he said, you are not your thoughts, you're the soul observing your thoughts.
Yeah.
And I thought that just put new context to this emotional, this internal dialogue I was having.
Yeah.
So can you talk for a moment about mindfulness, awareness? How did you develop it? How do others develop it?
Ooh. Whew. First of all, Untethered Soul is sitting on my bookshelf, and I started it and never finished it. So thank you for inspiring me. I developed mindfulness, a lot of therapy, a lot of therapy. I did talk therapy for many years. And now for the last 3.5 years, I've been doing what's called Somatic Therapy, which is body-based work. It does some incredible work for trauma. And those sessions, I meet with my somatic coach once a month. Those therapy sessions have really allowed me to ground the mindfulness work that I did for many years in yoga and meditation and talk therapy in my practice as an artist into my body. And I think my practice as an artist has done a lot for learning mindfulness too and being aware, because, there's a voice technique called the Linklater technique, Kristen Linklater. I learned that in college, and that really, you learn to locate what's happening inside your body emotionally and how you can unlock emotional blockages and tension so that your vessel, your body, can be fully moving as your instrument when you're a performer on stage. And so I've really used that concept in my real life of if I'm warming up for a show and my jaw's really tense, I go into my jaw. What's happening there? What am I feeling? Just like you were saying, where's the anger? Where's the sadness? So I learned it from the Linklater technique and acting and vocal training. I've learned it in therapy, like I said. I also, my mom's been practicing yoga and meditation since she was in college. So I grew up in a household where every day as I was getting ready for school, my mom was sitting in bed meditating, or doing yoga on her bedroom floor. And so that was a normal part of my upbringing in the 80s when that wasn't standard behavior in the rest of the United States. Like, we think yoga is so normal and hip now, but like that was weird in the 80s for Americans to be doing yoga. And so I started practicing yoga in late high school. So that was just part, and having a mother who meditated my whole life, it was in the forefront of my understanding. I grew up in a Reformed Jewish household, but we were talking about Eastern philosophy and meditation and mindfulness and breath work and reincarnation as much as, I was getting ready for my bat mitzvah. So that's a huge influence on me, is having a mother who is a spiritual mother and friend and colleague in this process, where, being able to talk about the soul's experience and the body's relationship to the soul in such a normal, fluid way, it is probably at the core and the foundation of my understanding of mindfulness and awareness. Again, it was just a matter of when it all sunk into place, right? Like, yoga was all around me growing up. And then we were on a family vacation in Hawaii when I was 17, and I decided to finally pick up and read this book on yoga my mom had on her lawn chair. But I was super stubborn. So if she had made me read it, I would have never read it on my own. But seeing it and wanting to on my own, I went back to the hotel room, read the whole thing, and started practicing this particular yoga sequence. So I think that's another thing about mindfulness and self-awareness, is giving ourselves permission and patience to go at our own pace. I'm an overachiever, so every day is the day I'm going to wake up and do yoga and meditate for an hour and live perfectly. And that never, ever happens. So if I can instead find a moment to take a few deep breaths, or I really love riding this one bus in New York City, the M5 bus up Riverside Drive. So often at the end of the day, if I'm not on tour and I'm in town, I'll find a way to take the bus home so that I can use that as a meditative practice and a mindfulness practice. Most people don't think of public transportation as meditative. So it's also about finding mindfulness in other things and other people, right? I know who the people are in my life that are calming and self-reflexive and giving in a particular way. I know the things that can allow me to be mindful. I bless my food before I eat it. I say a Hebrew prayer, and I say a bunch of English prayers I've made up myself. I said a prayer before we started today, which is a new practice for me, is saying a prayer and having a moment of mindfulness before going on stage, before running a workshop, before doing an interview. And that prayer thing for pre-teaching, pre-performing only came into my life in the last month. But I've been blessing my food for 10 years. That's the other thing, is it's a practice. It's not a practice means you're always working on it. You're always learning. You're always open to that fluidity again, and giving myself permission to grow in my practice as a mindful person.
So cool. Caroline, there is so much wisdom in all of what you've shared. What constantly pops up for me as you're talking is also the idea of the power of relationships in your life. So many of your stories are relating to key people, key conversations, whether it be counseling or your friends. It also was constantly showing up the environment that you're creating for yourself, whether it's one that you're physically creating by taking those pieces of paper or the journals and laying them out, or, physical items in your life that you were, your journal itself is that physical item. You held certain things close to you. You created environments where were nurturing for you to be able to share your theater experiences. That stage, has so many great metaphors to it, and your ability to share your comments so far about how that was, your ability to leave what's on stage. Also, your ability to leave what's not on stage there before you entered the stage. Just so much wisdom in all of what you've shared. And I feel like we may need a part 2 of this at some point because I'm having such a good time and I haven't even started in on all the questions I want to ask you. But let's transition here a little bit. So many folks that are exposed to the Front Row community have come by way of our charity, Front Row Foundation. And when Front Row Foundation, as you know, and as many people know, if you're new to the show, the Front Row Foundation helps children and adults who have a life-threatening illness we put them in the front row or give them a front row experience to the event of their dreams. And this is also a metaphor for how we can live every day of our lives. But a large part of this community is either personally dealing with a life-threatening illness or their family members are. And, with the 6 degrees of separation, there's probably not a person listening that hasn't been exposed to and dealt with death at some point in their life or the prospect of that. So how do you personally process death? And you mentioned earlier the loss of your brother. And again, my heart aches for you with any loss. I know you mentioned that you've experienced other loss in your life as well. So what thoughts have you developed around this topic? What can you share with us that might help ease the pain of somebody who's listening and maybe give a perspective on how to cope with this?
So timing is everything, literally, in a most painful and traumatic and tragic way, and also in a healing and important way. So literally this morning, I mentioned earlier that I was working on some pages for a book proposal, and I was literally editing a bunch of paragraphs on grief. Literally, and what I wrote was I was editing something I wrote about a week and a half ago because a friend of mine died unexpectedly in his sleep a week and a half ago. And I was struck the day that he died by how I processed that grief. I've experienced so much loss in my life, a lot of death beyond my brother, beyond my friend I talked about earlier, and other family members, other friends, other colleagues. And a week and a half ago when my friend died, I didn't cry all day. And I was like, am I heartless? Like, what's wrong with me? And I was like, or am I numb to this? What's happening? And by the time I got home that night and shut off my phone and sat down in bed and turned off the lights, that's when I started crying. And I realized that each death I've experienced, I've grieved very differently. And I realized that grief is as unpredictable as death itself. And we cannot prepare for death and we cannot prepare for grief. However, we can be preemptive and we can gather tools, right? Like we can gather tools to help prolong our mortality and to prevent death. And equally, we can gather tools to help us in grieving. And so for me, I mentioned earlier that I'm Jewish. Like I really appreciate how Judaism handles death. We have a practice called Shiva. And Shiva is this practice where you support the family in grieving. So there will be we bury our dead and then there's a funeral and then there is a Shiva practice, which is supposed to last for 7 days. It varies depending on people's religiosity, how long they sit Shiva. But when my brother died, Shiva was the most important week since he died, meaning that that if we hadn't have had that Shiva where friends and family were at our home constantly, making sure we were fed, bringing food, constantly making sure we were okay and allowing us to deliberately mourn and grieve for a week, I can't imagine how the last 13 years of my life would have been. But having that week of Shiva allowed me to deliberately grieve and begin my grieving process in a very specific way. And I've used Shiva as a metaphor throughout my life for other things. Like I went through a really big breakup a few years ago and I sat Shiva. Or when I was moving out of my partner in my apartment, I said the Jewish prayer for death, which is called the Mourner's Kaddish. I couldn't get myself out of my ex-partner in my apartment. And the only way I could get myself downstairs to join the movers to go to the storage space I was bringing my stuff to was to say the mourner's Kaddish. And one of the ways I healed was by sitting Shiva for the relationship. And so for me, Judaism has been really helpful in allowing me to cope with death. And going back to what I started with all this is understanding that grieving is fluid and changes and is not always the same. So the way that I've mourned my brother's death is different than I've mourned friends' deaths. And the other thing is that you just got to show up, not just for yourself, but for each other. I wrote an article many years ago for the Jewish Daily Forward about how, mourning doesn't end after Shiva. And I think sometimes after someone dies, we kind of forget to check in on their loved ones because it's like, oh, okay, they're fine now. And it's like, that grief could take a lifetime to process. So it's important to check in on people and to show up, not just in the immediacy of death, but ongoing. And to ask people, are you okay? And check in with them and ask them how they want to be supported in death. I ask people, is it okay if I check in on you? Or what's the most comfortable way to check in on you? Is it a phone call? Is it a text message? Is it an email? Is it showing up at your house? And do you want a hug? Do you not want a hug? Ask people questions, ask them what works for them, but keep showing up, and again, it goes back to me, Jewish tradition has informed a lot for me in learning how to mourn and heal and grieve because you show up, and that is really important. So I think that there's a lot of faith-based traditions that we can turn to and, different customs and practices throughout time on how people have coped with mortality that can inform a practice that works for each individual.
I think that's the key. And I think you nailed it with, listen, it shows up differently for everyone and everyone's going to find a unique tool in order to deal with it. And my thought is always to keep exploring and keep an open mind to what can work for you, because it may not be what worked for somebody else. It might be something totally different. And so it's wonderful that you've had those tools to deal with this. Caroline, I want to thank you, first of all, again, for being on the show. And your answers are so rich. They're thoughtful. They are just, and what I mean by rich is they're just rich with wisdom is really what I'm saying. So thank you. I want to get to because we're almost out of time and I know you've got things to do and I want to be respectful. I want to get into a section I'm now calling 10 in 1. And this is 10 questions for you that we're going to ask for you to answer in one word or one sentence. So just gut reaction.
Okay.
Fun questions here. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So question number 1, what's one thing that our community, those listening right now to this interview, can do in the next 24 hours to act with courage and live a front row life?
Write a love letter to the part of your body that you most often judge or question.
Beautiful. What does it mean to be fully alive?
Awe.
Awe.
Yeah.
Meaning to live in awe?
Yeah. To ask questions, to be curious, and to be in awe of those questions, no matter the answer.
Beautiful. Curiosity. Excellent. What problem do you most want to solve in the world?
I want to dismantle and help eliminate oppression.
Who are you a raving fan of?
Right now, I'm a raving fan of you.
All right. Good answer. That was what we were looking for. Number 5, what's the most powerful word in the English language?
Thank you.
Looking around your life right now, what brings you the most joy?
My sister's been really jazzing me up lately. She's my best friend.
What is the first or earliest memory that is your happiest memory that you can recall?
I don't know, but my mother came to mind and my family. And so I'm just going to assume that it's somewhere with my parents when I'm 3 or 4 years old, smiling and dancing.
Love it. If you had to pick one person to switch brains with for a day, who would it be?
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Why is that? One word or one sentence?
I want to understand how he's able to take his thoughts and put them into the sentences he creates with his prose.
Cool. What's something fun that you've collected in your lifetime?
Books.
If you could be front row to any event, and you have to be able to go to this event today, currently, or this year, what would you want to go see?
Hamilton. On Broadway. Who's got tickets for me?
All right. Hey, community, keep that in mind. If you like this interview, find a way. Hashtag get Caroline front row to Hamilton. All right. So Caroline, that's it for the rapid fire questions. We're out of time. I'm so crushed about that I'm just praying that we'll do a round 2 of this at some point down the road. You've given our community so much. Thank you. Thank you. Just thank you. I can't wait to talk with you even after the show to celebrate with you this hour that we've spent together, because I feel like I've grown so much as a person because of it. Where do people go get more Caroline?
You can get more Caroline at www.carolinerothstein.com. I'm also on Facebook. Caroline Rothstein Official is my fan page. On Twitter, CE Rothstein, and on Instagram, Caroline Rothstein. And I love to stay in touch over social media. And you can find more about my work and booking me for performances and workshops and speaking engagements in your community by emailing booking@carolinerothstein.com and checking out more on my website.
So cool. And we'll link to all that at frontrowfactor.com. Caroline, I want to thank you again. The world is definitely a better place with you in it. And as a father of 2 boys, I want to thank you for shaping a community, a global community that they are growing up in right now. You're making a real difference. You're good for my soul. I know you're good for many others. Thank you so much. I can't wait to do this again.
Thank you. This was an absolute honor and privilege. I also have learned so much today. So thank you for being a vessel and a guide in allowing, even me, the interview subject, to feel like I'm more in the front row of my life than I was even an hour ago. And so I'm really honored and deeply grateful. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And this is great. We'll end it on that note. Caroline, thanks so much. Chat with you soon.
Bye.
All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed our chat today with Caroline Rothstein. Check her out at carolinerothstein.com or go to frontrowfactor.com and check out more on Caroline in the show notes that we have there for you. Check out her encore interview, too. In just a couple of days, we release that on Wednesdays. It's about 10 minutes. It's Q&A with you, the community. So do you want to ask questions to our guest? Go to frontrowfriends.com, and that'll take you right to our Facebook page. You can join the community, post your questions there, and we'll ask them on your behalf. Hey, who do you know that would love today's show? Do them a favor and give the gift of this audio interview with Caroline. She has so much great wisdom. Share that with somebody and say, hey, there's some great ideas in here I thought you would appreciate. Also, if you are somebody who has a passion for speaking, just like Caroline, for sharing your message, but you don't know how, you want to hone your skill of presenting and delivering. If you're a trainer, you work with people and you want to learn how to share compelling stories or to communicate with clarity, then check out speakertrainerexperience.com. That is a place online where you can get some free resources, and also you can learn about our upcoming March event where we are going to teach people how to communicate powerfully, how to deliver a message that connects with your audience and creates true transformation. That's it for today, everybody. Can't wait to have you back on the next show. FrontRowFactor.com for more. Until next time, keep living your life in the front row.
That's all for this episode of the Front Row Factor. To discover more simple and effective ways to lead a fearless front row life, please visit frontrowfactor.com and subscribe to John's 4 Minutes in the Front Row, where he shares quick stories from real life experiences. Thanks again for joining us today. We hope our show inspires you to live big, give big, and experience life to the fullest. See you next time on the Front Row Factor.